actually this lecture of mine. This actually was kind of a big topic. It's structure and setting, and those can mean very different things when it comes to roleplay, depending on the context you're using them in. So how to approach this was sort of a challenge, but I think I settled on something that is informative, that'll help people, especially new RPers, who perhaps are a bit overwhelmed when they first start out. So before we start, I'm just going to post the link to my lecture on the forum. There you go. So if you want to read along, or if you want to, go back and read after I'm done, if you want to reference it, or if you just want to ask questions afterwards and you want to look through it, there you go. But yes, I want everyone to think on questions. Think on questions and ask away when I'm done. So, let us get to it. Structure and setting. They're fundamental aspects of storytelling, roleplay included, and yet they are almost by nature nebulous, at least at first. So we're going to break down these areas in the realm of roleplay. Setting. This hinges on what I'll term constructive setting development. Constructive setting development rests on the premise of collaboration. If you are involved in a roleplay community, you are not writing solo stories. Even if it is a solo thread or a solo story arc and it's clearly marked as such and everyone sees it and you've got free reign to just do your thing, you are still writing in a world that is not entirely yours. Your fellow RPers call the map you're on home as much as you do. The basics of this reality dictate some things which are common courtesy. Don't use fellow RPers' characters without their permission. Don't claim another country did something without its RPer giving you the green light. Don't assume something that involves someone else's creation without working details out with that person. Now, these seem like basic concepts, but they transition well into the larger point of constructive setting development. Many people see these tips as restrictions. They are not. They're invitations, asking you to engage with your fellow RPers, not just to flesh out the setting as a whole, but to enrich your own world. Prydania is a good example of this. At my start in Eris, which is TNP's primary forum RP setting, I had a nation that was mostly homogenous. It was a nation settled by Viking colonists, and Prydanian, which I used Icelandic for, was the language used by almost everyone. Prydania was very samey, even if I made allowances for a minority of Shadaists, Eris's equivalent of Jews. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself, but it does seem rather lacking compared to what I have now for Prydania. These days, most Prydanians are of Viking background, but those Vikings now have a source, Andrenian and Goianian Vikings, thanks to collaboration with Andy and Goy. There's also a Dutch Slavic ethnic minority that remains from the Viking invasion, the Bayardi. That was thanks to collaboration with Nog. That wasn't part of my original vision for Prydania. That happened because I collaborated with Nog. There's also an AK ethnic minority, thanks to collaboration with Felis. Again, something I didn't plan from the start, but I added later. Communities across Kings Lake speak a pidgin dialect of Prydanian and Norsean, which is Czech, thanks to collaboration with Norcia. And that Goianian and Andrenian past means that most Prydanians speak at least one of those languages as secondary languages to their own. And Prydania's history with Saintage means that Santonian, French, is a growing language that's being taught in Prydania. That was thanks to collaboration with Kyle. The core of my vision for Prydania, a nation founded by Vikings with a Norse language, remains. That in and of itself remains an accurate descriptor for Prydania. Yet, by engaging with my fellow RPers, I not only filled in their history a bit more, but they also enriched Prydania's history. No nation in the world is an ethnically homogenous whole. People who approach RP with "my nation is based on this IRL culture and everyone is that" are not really reflecting reality. And the best way to reflect reality, that even seemingly homogenous nation states are diverse, is to collaborate with your fellow RPers. Setting is a big term, but building it starts on the micro level. Everyone building the basic blocks of their own nations and then looking elsewhere for inspiration and collaboration with their fellow RPers. I have often said that RP is essentially a massive collaborative creative writing project. That's often understood to go for things like collaboration on stories. And that is important, don't get me wrong. What is equally important, however, is the collaboration that comes with tying your creation to your fellow RPers' creations. Remember, you're not just making adjustments to accommodate them. They're making adjustments to accommodate you. Every change I made to Prydania on my end required one of the RPers I collaborated with to make changes on theirs as well. I did it, and they did it, because the creative enterprise we were engaged in helped build the world of Eris and TNP as a whole. Essentially, don't be afraid to make compromises or changes to your vision, because every time you do, the person you're RPing with, the person that you're collaborating with, is making changes themselves. It's a two-way street, and that is what collaboration is about. This approach is especially vital in feeders. User regions have a certain luxury in being able to plan out things from the start. A sort of planned community approach to RP. Whereas feeder regions like TMP, by necessity, need to take this micro approach to encourage people to build their nations up and then work within a broad community to work out more intertwined histories and stories. I should note, however, that even the planned community approach that some user regions go with requires a degree of flexibility, where new players are free to explore the setting and seek out connections and inspirations that may not have been part of the community foundation's original vision. The planned community approach is by no means bad, but it works best when it adopts a degree of feederite flexibility. My years spent in a strict planned RP community like Taijutsu have taught me that micromanaging a RP setting to conform to a vision is a recipe for disaster that kills interest. So setting is best understood as an organic thing, a sandbox for creativity to thrive, for people to feel encouraged to form interesting histories, stories, and ties between their creations that enriches the overall world. Organic is the key word, because once you till the metaphorical soil and plant the metaphorical seeds, it should grow by its own designs, by the individual creative minds of each RPer. So long as people remain cooperative rather than competitive and keep themselves dedicated to good faith action rather than trying to manipulate others to win. So now, that was setting. Let's move on to structure. Structure can mean many things in an RP setting. The structure of the world? Well, we covered that. Insofar as that goes, the lessons are simple. Understand collaboration and understand that some ideas might be taken once you arrive. Do not arrive in an RP setting that has been going for a while and claim the invention of the radio, for example. Chances are that's either already been world built, or claiming such inventions are against the setting's rules. So structure in that sense, i.e. how the world works, is understood as a continuation of the above talk on setting. It should ideally be organic, and a new RPer is tasked with working out to fit themselves into that structure. It should be easy, so long as they understand the need to be cautious, respectful, and flexible in some of their ideas. Beyond that, however, is the concept of story. World building, which the setting section covered, is vital, and it, at least in part, exists for the sake of telling stories. World building builds the setting. Storytelling tells you what happens within it. So how do you structure a RP story? It's a difficult question in NS. We all assume, or assumed at one point, that we had to structure ourselves from a nation-first perspective. This is a flawed approach, in my opinion. The simple answer to the questions, how do I start RPing and what should I do, is to use character to define a story structure. And here's how you do that. So let's take war. War is a fundamental part of national RP, is seen as fundamental part of national RP by many. And it's usually at least somewhat on the mind of every new RPer who joins a national RP community. This is a mistake that places you, the new RPer, on the defensive. As stated before, TNP has vibrant RP communities. Eris on the forums, Stranger Only RMB, etc. Each community is structured and run by a dedicated team of mods, and each has its own rules for what is and isn't permissible. So when you join an RP community, you're going to want to educate yourself on the rules of war within your RP community of choice. Understand what you're allowed to do and what your fellow RPers are allowed to do. You want to be aware of this so you can stay away from war RP for the time being. This isn't to say that war RP is invalid. It's very much a staple of the national RP scene. For the sake of new RPers trying to get started, however, war is noise, an easy distraction that can quickly overwhelm them. So if you've just started out, familiarize yourself with the rules of war in the RP community of your choice so you can keep out of it for now. The same applies to other events that we think of staples of national RP. International summits, sporting events, diplomatic meetings, grand galas. All of this you're going to get to in due time. For right now, though, block it out. Your RP will suffer if you rush into any of these things without first considering the character side of your national RP. RP is a collaborative creative writing exercise. And what kind of writing? It's fiction. Both of our RP communities and TNP are varied enough that you can get a bit of fantasy, realistic fiction, and science fiction in both. Which one you choose is a matter of personal preference. The broader point, however, is that this is ultimately an endeavor in writing fiction, and fiction hinges on some sort of narrative. Random letters from your nation's leader to another nation's leader isn't a narrative. Random statements on international current events aren't narratives. They're fine on their own as supplemental material to a broader story, but many new RPers start with this sort of thing and struggle to progress beyond it. They struggle because they're trying to write fiction while using elements that are not conducive to building a narrative. Say you're starting out and you have your nation, Brolandia. Okay. What is the story of Brolandia? What's its current status? Is it facing an impending economic crisis? Is it on the brink of civil war? Maybe it's recovering from a civil war. You also want to ask yourself some questions about your nation. Who are the political factions? Their motivations? Their key players? Who's in charge? You're going to want to set that scene, the backdrop that your characters will play out in front of. Again, fiction needs a narrative, and developing a narrative relies on direction. The direction you want your nation to go in is the starting point. Once you've decided that, you move on to the character aspect. And this is where national and character RP intersect. Many believe that the two are separate, almost separate genres of RP, but this is where character RP can be used to drive national RP. Once you have a direction for your nation to go in, you need to ask whose story is this? Which of your characters is going to be the driving point that you need to tell the story? Which of these characters is going to be the driving point of your narrative? Is it going to be your national leader? Is it the opposition leader? A general? Maybe a mid-level bureaucrat with big plans? Or maybe some random guy on the street? Whoever it is, you need to tell the story of your nation through them. They are the focal point of your narrative and your way to stay grounded. To write their personal story and to use that to advance the story of your nation. To be clear, this does not mean focusing on only one character. A cast of characters is preferable. I'd say think of it as prestige TV, like HBO, Netflix, Hulu, There's a star to be sure, but you want a well-rounded cast. And breaking away now and then isn't bad. The key is to deploy the same general technique when you do. Say, for example, that your nation's president is your main character, and you suddenly find yourself in a war RP. You're going to have to switch to a general. You're going to have to switch to a general or a sergeant or a foot soldier as a new point of view character to convey much of that war story. Just make sure that this new character is the focal point of this new narrative. Treat them as you would your overall RP's main character. RP is fiction, narratives drive fiction, character drives narratives. You need to flesh out the direction of your country, figure out who your characters are, and develop their backstories and motivations. This will give your RP direction. People tend to get overwhelmed by national RP. War, international incidents, diplomatic summits, grandiose government statements, they assume this is all it is. And all of that is very important. But it's also empty and directionless without a narrative direction and character to focus on, however. A war RP that's just going over the strategic and tactical troop movements with battle outcomes is far less engaging than a story about soldiers in the thick of fighting motivated by their own sense of duty, survival, fear, and courage. A diplomatic meeting where all people do is agree to trade terms and blandly shake hands and make statements is far less engaging than a story about people with hopes, dreams, fears, trying to do what's best for their country within the confines of the international system. These aren't robots, they're characters. Within the world of the story, they're supposed to be human beings, or other assorted sentient life forms. Your mileage may vary depending on your setting. An international festival where a world leader arrives via car and steps out is far less engaging than a story about a world leader who arrives, partakes in dancing, makes small talk with their peers, and engages with other RPers with a compelling character to work with. It's through effective character RP that you can find structure that will guide the direction of your national RP as a whole. In conclusion, I'm going to say it again, roleplay is an exercise in collaborative creative writing. I cannot emphasize that enough. Once you understand that, then questions about setting and structure fall into place. You work with others, not competing with them. You develop rich histories and stories that will inform how your nation develops in new and perhaps unintended ways. I never planned for the Bayardi or AK to be part of Prydania, but they ended up that way. And I'm happy with it. And your focus on characters rather than a broad nebulous government that cannot be characterized as the driving force of your stories. Create people who we, the readers, can invest in, and use them to drive the story of your nation. It's not enough to just say you have a nation. You need to have a story you want to tell with it. To enrich the setting as a vehicle for characters to drive a narrative worth reading and engaging with. And that is pretty much my spiel. So, if anyone has any questions, if anyone has any questions, concerns, statements they'd like to say, feel free to ask or say them. To those saying thank you, you're most welcome. I had a lot of fun. I didn't stumble over my words nearly as much as I thought I would, so, that's always nice. So Alder asks, so essentially you're saying structure the story for RPs from the point of views of the characters involved. Yeah, it kind of seems like a simple thing when you say it, but I've noticed that a lot of people enter RP, they enter an RP community in nation states, and it's usually the same pattern. They enter, people in the community ask them, oh, hey, what's your nation about? What culture are you based off of? Maybe what's your flag? And then, this person has all that basic information, and they say it, and then they have nothing left to do, and they go, what do I do? How do I RP? I don't know what to do. And it's because they enter RP from a nation-first perspective, and they think, how do I RP as a country? And that's a big ask, and it doesn't always work out the best way. They usually just enter. They say, like, I have a concept for a country. I joined an RP community. I don't know what to do. So what you want to do, Alder, is you think of a cast of characters. You find someone who is a dedicated point of view protagonist, and you tell their personal story as a character, and you focus the story of the nation through them. And that's going to give your RP direction. Because instead of now trying to RP an entire country, you are RPing one person. And that's or a group of people. And it's far more manageable. And you're going to find it's very versatile and will allow you to continue to flesh out your nation through the perspective of, a smaller cast of characters. Hitting roadblocks in world building. Honestly, I find that the best thing that helps with roadblocks is music. Honestly, whatever music inspires you creatively, just listen to that. Think on your nation think on whatever you're hitting a roadblock with as you're listening to music, and it helps. Okay, so Peekaboo has a question. Do you think world building drives national RP? As a character RPer new to nation states, I still find it bizarre to build a country. An entire setting seems like a monumental feat to me. For me, the setting has always been up to the RPer master. In this case, it's very collaborative. It's very collaborative, but there's so many things to consider. So, to Peekaboo's question, it honestly comes down to personal preference. I know a lot of people find a lot of creative inspiration in world building. But if you're approaching this from a character RPer, like I am, I would say that character stuff is probably the best to focus on. Not to say that world building is bad. It's actually not. I find it to be very relaxing and fun, actually. But I find that the things that I world build personally fall into two categories. It's either stuff that I need to flesh out a story. So I'm writing, I'm in the middle of a story and I'm writing something and I need something world built for the sake of the story, or it's something that has no connection to a story, but I just felt inspired to do it. And I think that is honestly a good way to go about it, because while, only world building things as you need them is very helpful to a character RPer, it is also nice to have a bank of things that you can draw on for the world of your nation, and you can and in a lot of ways, having a bank of things can lead to different inspirations. I have world built things that I had no need for in my story. I just got inspired to do it. I had an idea. I world built something, and then it kind of just sat there. And then maybe a few months down the line, I have a story for it in mind, or someone else approaches me and goes, "Hey, what if we do this with that thing that you world built?" So I would say, Peekaboo, to your question, focus on character RP, but you should also focus on world building now and then. And you are right. It's a monumental feat. So don't think of it like a monumental feat. Think of it as just world building the things that you find an interest in, be it sports, be it entertainment, be it media, be it car companies or train companies or airline companies or the company that makes cardboard boxes in your nation. Anything that you might find interesting or quirky or weird or cool to just world build, do that. And as you are writing your character-driven stories, having stuff that you've already world built as a basis to draw on is going to be very helpful. So, Gaunt asks, my first question is related to setting in terms of collaborative environment. Do you think it's better to have a sort of rule by community consensus, a small group of lore masters, or one person who sort of organizes the roleplay setting? One person is absolutely a terrible idea. I would say. Flexibility is broadly positive, I think. And if you have one person who is just sort of the arbiter of everything, then things become less flexible, and that's no good. I think that I think the best way forward is a combination of community consensus and lore masters. So what we have in NS RP on TNP is something called the Conclave, which is a group of RPers who have been tasked with figuring out canon of the world. And they also work to resolve canonical disputes if two people have an argument. At the same time, though, they are not all powerful for that. They don't really, they're not ruling by decree on everything. They kind of they are there for when issues of canon come up, or if there is something that needs sorting, they're there. But broadly, community consensus works well, I find. The thing that comes to mind is something actually. Kyle is here, and he's in TNP. He is in NS RP. He is putting forward a plan about like the history of the establishment of Eris's Prime Meridian, right? And it's being treated as a very community-driven thing. It's open to submissions, to ideas, to people, sort of saying, oh, this is how time as a concept developed in my nation versus other nations, and it's a very collaborative thing. So I think if you have a community consensus with a smaller group of lore masters on top to sort out any kinks in the in the works, that's probably the best way to go about fostering a collaborative community. You need that community consensus, but you also need a small group of people on top to just sort of, work out the road bumps that come up along the way. Laura brings up a good point. It's always good to reach out to others to, farm some general ideas.
I have a question, Pry.
Okay.
Teach.
Oh my
what would
God.
you say is the what would you say is the best way to integrate yourself into like an RP community that already has a lot of background and story?
So I touched a bit on this, but that's actually a really good question, because I would have gone off on a rant had I decided to stick with that train of thought, because there's a lot to it. I think the best way is to just be flexible. Flexible in your own expectations. And I'm going to use myself as an example again. Mostly because I don't care if I insult myself, so, whatever. I don't want to misrepresent anyone by using them as an example, so I'm just going to use myself. I came into Eris with the idea that I was going to do a Viking nation. And of course, the story of Prydania that I had was already worked out, but in terms of the culture, I knew it was going to be Nordic, Viking, Scandinavian, however you want to describe it. And I joined Eris knowing there was a good chance there would be other nations there that had that national origin, right? That Scandinavian, Nordic, Viking, whatever, that's one of the popular ones. Now, I wanted to do it, and I wasn't going to let the fact that it was, quote unquote popular stop me. That's what I wanted to do, and I was going to do it. But I also adjusted my expectations to know I wasn't going to be the only one to do it. So I went in kind of completely divorcing myself from the notion that I was going to be the origin of a lot of Nordic Viking culture in this new setting. I completely was like, I'm probably not going to get that. If it happened that there weren't any and I was the first one, then fine. But I knew there was a chance that there's a very high chance that I wouldn't be. And so I adjusted my expectations that way. And then when I came in, I said, okay, well, there are other Nordic countries that have been in this setting longer, that have established histories. So what I did was I reached out to them and I said, hey, I'm kind of doing the same thing as you. Can we work on a shared history? Can we figure out, how we can get everything to work together? And thankfully, the people I talked to were very eager to collaborate, and we worked out something that worked for everyone. And I'm happy; they're happy. I integrated into this established setting pretty well because I was willing to reach out to people and collaborate. Now, that is a very basic example because it's me talking about finding other nations that shared my nation's ethnic background or starting point. But it really goes for anyone. The keys that when you join, you want to listen and you want to read. Don't assume things. Read what people have written, ask questions, and listen. And get a feel for the setting that you're joining. You want to understand how it works. You want to understand how people interact with each other. And then, once you get to a certain point where you feel comfortable, you start building up and you start reaching out. There is no set timetable for this. It's going to depend person to person. But, PAX, I think you yourself were a pretty good example of this. You came into Eris after it had, it's been around for a while. You came into it and you were like, okay, I'm going to do this. And you dedicated yourself to building that thing. And then you started looking around to your neighbors on the part of the map you were at, and you worked out some shared history, and you built on that, and that led to some stories and threads, and it was all very well done. So I think that, what you did is actually a pretty good roadmap for how new players should approach a setting that has been going on for a while. Know what you want to do, dedicate yourself to that, and observe the community around you. And the final point, the absolute final point, whose importance I don't think can be overstated enough, is don't feel intimidated. A lot of RP communities have been around a while, on first glance might seem like closed communities or a tight-knit group. And the fact of the matter is that, in my experience, that if you enter a well-run RP community, even if it seems kind of closed and tight-knit, if you put yourself out there, if you put your ideas out there, and you're willing to collaborate with people, then other people will be welcoming and will be encouraging.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, you're welcome. Felix said it's lucky that the other Nordic RPers were some of the community's best. Yeah, that helped. And Kyle also has a very interesting and good write-up, and also references to Peekaboo's earlier question, so you should all read that. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments or concerns, or you want to just yell at me and tell me I'm wrong about everything? You can do that too. I'm used to it. So, you know.
What are good ways to come up with backstory?
So, oh, Fiji said it was very tempting to yell at me. That's mean. Come on, Fiji. Come on, be cool. Okay, so the gaps question, you're wrong about the wrong things. Yeah, so I don't. So Gaunt is gonna touch on backstory on Thursday, and I don't want to step on his toes or anything. So I'm just gonna keep this really brief, and I'm going to say, draw on the fiction that inspires you. A lot of what I'm doing with Prydania in RP draws on the fact that I like stuff like Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, King Arthur, Mythos, Beowulf. Those are the fictional stories that I enjoy, and you know, if you read anything that I've written with Prydania, you will see a lot of that. You'll see a lot of that inspiration. So I'd say that, you know, whatever fiction inspires you, you know, don't be afraid to lean on that, or to put it, or to steal a line from the excellent website TV Tropes. Tropes aren't bad. Just because a character follows an archetype does not mean that that character is bad. Fact of the matter is that all stories written by everyone in human history conform to some archetype or another, or conform to some structure or another. So don't be afraid to take inspiration from something that you enjoy or find particularly moving. There's nothing wrong with that. So I'm going to stop there, because anything else is going to be stepping on Gaunt's toes, and I don't want to do that. Esp asks, what would you say the 3 most important things of any to have figured out about your nation before hopping into RP? I'm tempted to say the flag, but that's just because I like designing flags. So that's not but you know, that's a joke answer. I'd say the 3 most important things are: 1, history. Now, history is different than culture. You know, you can play around with your culture a bit. You can switch from Germanic to French to Swahili as your cultural basis, and that won't necessarily affect the story. Most story narratives you can come up with can be adapted to most cultural bases. So I would say the story is the thing that you need, is the number one thing you have to figure out. What is the state of your country in the present? Is it prosperous? Is it poor? Is it peaceful? Is it in the middle of a civil war? That's what you got to figure out. What is the story? 2 is, who is your viewpoint character? And your viewpoint character can be anyone. It can be anyone from the nation's leader to some guy on the street, but you need to have a character in mind that you're going to use as your vehicle to tell the first point, which is the story. So you figure out the story, and then you figure out the character you're going to tell it through. And the third is what I touched on with 1, which is culture. Culture is important. It's not the most important, but eventually you're going to have to pick the culture that you want to use as your basis. And it could be anything, you know. It could be something based in the real world. Well, anything you use is going to be based in the real world, because we are humans, and our only points of reference are the experiences around us. So even people who try to create original things end up drawing from the real world anyway. So when you get to culture, which again is number 3, you want to figure that out, and you want to do a bit of building off of it, because it's going to give you culturally relevant touchstones that you can build 1 or 2 on. One is your story. What is the state of your nation? 2 is the character you're going to tell that story through. And 3, culture is going to be the cultural touchstones and the references that are going to fill out the worlds of 1 and 2. So, yeah, that's what I would say. Story, character, culture. Is culture a reference point of history? Oh, interesting. Well, culture is a reference point for history. I mean, that is an interesting one. I suppose it. I suppose it fundamentally depends on the way that you look at it, doesn't it? Because it seems like a fundamental chicken and the egg question. It really just depends on the perspective that you take. I'd say, I mean, fundamentally, if you're asking for my opinion, and I would stress this is just my opinion and not a definitive answer to this question, because this question by its very nature doesn't have a definitive answer. I would say that I subscribe to Tolkien's view, which is that history creates culture. That, history, the events of a people's history inform language, which informs culture. That's my opinion, but again, I'd stress that it's very much just my opinion, and because this is something that can't really be answered definitively one way or the other. So should I definitely hold off on wrapping up historical relations before I dive into RP and character? No, not necessarily, Alder. I've found in my experience in RP that if I start writing a character or a story that is compelling enough, then it will draw other RPers in. Again, using my own experiences as an example. The first RP I did in TNP Eris RP was called Over the Hills and Back, and I had no plans. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know who was going to get involved. I just started the RP and I started writing it. And as I did, people responded to it. People liked the story and people responded to it, and they asked me if they could get involved, and we worked on ways that they could get involved. So don't think that you need to wrap up historical relations first. What you want, if you have a story that you want to tell, dive into it, and if it's compelling enough, then it will draw other people to you. All right, so we got Kal Nartia. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. He says, not wrong, Pride. The reverse would also be that culture creates history, because if we see history as an abstraction of our past in relation to our present, cultural understandings of those events inform how we reconstruct them. This also comes from the archaeological, anthropological framework, but I don't want to start hijacking your lecture. No, don't worry about it. You're absolutely right. Like I said, there is no right or wrong answer, and what you just posted is just as right as what I said. There it is. Kyle said that they feed off of each other like a cycle, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable explanation for it. Culture informs history, and history informs culture. The fact that both culture and history are abstract concepts makes it even harder to kind of figure it out, but they feed off of each other, definitely. That's what has been happening. My people have made contacts with the home world, and I got people approaching me. Yes, Esp, that is a very good point. And your stuff in Aeneas has been very, very good, and it's another example. And Aeneas, for those who aren't aware, is one of the two sci-fi settings that we have on TNP's forums. And Esp, yeah, you've been doing a lot of great work, and you've just hit your, put your nose to the grindstone. You've just written a really cool story, and it's drawn people to it just because it's a good story. So, to Alder's point, don't feel like you have to hold up. If you have a story you want to tell, write it, and people will come. Oh, thank you so much, Kalnartia. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've got a BA in history, a minor in English literature, and a MA in history. So it's very I love this stuff. It's very fun to talk about, and I kind of had to stop myself from turning the lecture into that as I was typing it, because that would have been a whole other thing. Well, Felis, that's because I am. Gaunt. He says, to what extent do you think a role player setting is determined by a character's perspective? If we assume that the world is interpreted through the senses of people, same could be true of characters in an RP setting. I've encountered this in other regions before, where writers attempt to present a role-playing world as an absolute commodity, where I disagree with that and say that how the world is interpreted is subjective and varies from character to character. I think that's absolutely right, Gaunt. There are certain things that are absolute commodities in an RP setting, but a lot of it is up to the interpretation of characters, and that's something that I think there's value in. I think there's value in using characters to present alternative viewpoints on certain subjects. Just going off of again my own history. I keep using myself as an example because I know I won't insult anyone or get anything wrong. But in my own role play, I'm doing a thing called Over the Hills and Back, which is an RP about the Prydanian Civil War. And, it's primarily told from one perspective and one side's perspective, because at the end of the day, that's kind of how I'm structuring things. But it does dip into the point of view of other people. And it's on other sides, and it's really interesting to see how different events sort of cascade into each other when you kind of look at it from different perspectives, and kind of seeing how things that are said to one character with the best of intentions end up completely leading to something unintended. So I would say absolutely, Gaunt. The world is interpreted. The roleplay world is subjective from character to character. Absolutely. Oh, we've got an Egyptologist in the chat. Awesome. Awesome. I feel like if I ever fell down the Egyptology rabbit hole, I'd just obsess over the pre-dynastic period. Like, I feel like that's just what I would obsess over. Farhan. 19th dynasty. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Kalnartia. Absolutely. Gant asks, do you think that War RP is played up to the point of becoming a trope? How can you make a War RP setting original and interesting even after the sheer volume that we've seen on NS over the years? I would say that it has become a trope, Gaunt, but I would also say that tropes aren't inherently bad. I would say that how do we make a War RP setting original? Best way I could answer that is to just say what I find interesting about War RP, which is this. And I know I might upset some people. I don't mean to upset anyone. I'm just kind of giving my own perspective here. And I'm not saying that other perspectives are wrong. I'm just putting my own out there, which is I don't find controversial. I don't find a strategy game-esque series of posts that tells me about troop movements to be very compelling at all. I don't care for it. What I find interesting is what I find interesting are the stories of the soldiers involved, the leaders who have to make tough decisions, how those leaders react after those decisions are made, how soldiers react in the midst of fighting. I want to read about a soldier who is desperately trying to muster the courage to perform their duty under the stress of combat. Then I do a post about troop movements and, who's going where. That doesn't tell me anything. I'm not invested in posts saying, we moved however many troops here and took the city. I don't care. I want to hear about the soldiers who took the city, and I want to hear about who, what their experiences in combat were like. I want to read about characters that I can get emotionally invested in. And if you write those stories well, you can also provide that overall plot. If you write through the perspective of just one soldier who's doing his best to do his duty in the middle of a war, you can also use that perspective to show us what's happening on a macro level, right? It's not an either or. You can give the reader a character who they can invest in and who they can care about, and also use that character's perspective to give them a broader picture of whatever the conflict is. And so I'd say to Gon's question, I'd say that is how you go about making War RP interesting. At least that's what I find interesting about War RP. Farhan asks, how do you think the historiography employed by an RP or out of character or a narrator in character impacts the structure of a story, such as character-driven, narrative-driven, theme-driven, etc.? Additionally, as a follow-up question, do you think that describing changes in settings can be an effective tool for conveying themes and the prominence of historical events? That's quite an interesting one. I think that in terms of, there are a lot of levels here, so I'm just trying how to find the best way to handle it. I think that it depends on how you want to present the big T truth. In terms of history, when we study history, everyone's always chasing the big T truth, and that's a chase that you're never really gonna latch onto, with few exceptions. But the impact the aspect of writing RP means that we kind of do have a means of working out what the actual history was, and we have a way of, and we also have the opportunity to describe how that history is understood. And again, I'm going back to my own examples here, but whatever. The main character For the King to Valhalla is Prince Tobias. And there is a post where he's asking someone who is a historian-esque character, like, basically, is the pseudo-historical mythological character Aesir real? Now, Aesir, in the context of the RP, is supposed to be the historical legendary patriarch of Prince Tobias's family. And Toby, in this scene, is basically asking a historian, did this guy really exist? And I had the historian answer, ultimately, it doesn't matter, because the story of this person has inspired people before. And if there's value in that, then it's worth hanging on to. Now, in my mind, Aesir, in all likelihood, is probably a collection, is probably a historical fiction that was cobbled together from various other historical sources, and that which created this legendary founder character. But that's me as sort of the out of character person saying, okay, that's what really happened. But from an internal narration perspective, there's no way that the characters within the world can know that. I know that because I'm the author, but my characters don't know that. And so they have to try to grapple with it. And they have to try to say, well, maybe he did exist, or maybe he didn't, or there's compelling evidence this way or that way, and on and on and on and on it goes. And that can be really interesting because it can be a useful tool for describing perspectives, right? I can use it to describe different perspectives in characters, depending on which way they kind of go on that. Are they someone who adheres to the traditional historical narrative? Are they more skeptical? Are they more scholarly? Are they more nationalistic? So on and so forth. Now, in terms of narration impacting the structure of a story, I think it really depends. You mentioned character-driven, narrative-driven, theme-driven. I don't necessarily see these as fundamentally different aspects. I think they all kind of work in concert with each other. Obviously, some posts, some stories will lean more one way or the other, but I think they all kind of work together. But it really all just depends on the point of view that you want to give us, the readers, into the story. I don't know if that was a very helpful answer, but that's what came to mind. Additionally, the follow-up question: do you think that describing changes in settings can be an effective tool for conveying themes and the prominence of historical events? Absolutely, I do. I'm actually a big fan of that. I love doing that. So I would say absolutely for your follow-up. No, it's fine. It's fine. Kylarnatia, sorry. Bleh. Kyle. We've got two Kyles. I'm trying to keep the Kyles straight. He says he vibes with my approach, and I feel happy. Thank you. And yes, I would say that I very much I'm very much in line with Kyle Nartia's perspective. Oh, sorry. I missed. I missed Kaoki's question. I'm so sorry. So let me go back and read that one. So Kaoki asks, when it comes to a matter of character perspective, there are often circumstances where I end up with a set of posts focusing on entirely different characters, but only for a short time. This is especially prevalent in wars and such, where various fronts and situations must be showcased. How viable would you generally consider this kind of approach when compared to more singular but detached character perspectives? I think it's very viable, and it all depends on the story you want to tell. I would broadly say, Kyoki, that when you're dealing with, say, a multi-front war, it is very helpful to dip in and out of different character perspectives, right? It is very helpful to pivot. I often liken the idea of your quote-unquote main character as a guiding point, and you can pivot from that point to various other characters. So if you have a multi-front war, it is absolutely viable and helpful to have various different characters in various different parts of the story to give their perspective. And that's what I think a lot of people need to be comfortable with, is people need to be comfortable with the idea that, oh, hey, I'm telling a multi-front war. I'm going to have this character on this front provide some perspective on that front, and then maybe we don't come back to him because maybe the perspective that he provided is all the story needs. But once you've done that, you can then start talking about, you can then bring that character back in future RPs. I have tons of characters in my RPs that started off as singular characters in random posts, and then I went back. I was like, you know what? I could do something with this, and then I bring them back, and suddenly they've become a main character. So the approach that you described, Kaoki, is absolutely viable. Absolutely. It's actually really funny, Kiyoki, in a post of mine. I needed a random character for a news post, so I pulled a name out and I put them into that news post, and I worked out a bit of their backstory for the sake of that news post. Long story short, over a period of a few weeks, that went from random character in a news post, and now there's like an entire thread dedicated to their family. And it's just because I found it interesting, and I was able to go back and I was able to go, oh, I'll talk about this character some more, and suddenly I'm writing an RP about their family. So hundreds of named characters, only 8 who matter. Well, I mean, that's the thing. If you have hundreds of named characters, you can start going back and you can say, oh, I haven't touched you in about 3 months, but, I have an idea for you now. So that is certainly a good approach, Farhan. Absolutely. It just depends. If you plan it out, it can be really cool, right? Like, you don't dump all the exposition at once, and as the RP sort of unfolds, maybe different bits of information are revealed here and there, and that can be a really fun thing to do as a writer. Probably not tonight, Gap, but I will tomorrow. And other Kyle, I'm sorry, I've your other Kyle now. I agree with that approach. Yeah. My storytelling cast has expanded as well, and it's always nice when you have that extended cast that you can draw on.